October 12, 1944. Rural Pennsylvania. The words came during evening roll call, spoken by Sergeant Davis in his usual clipped tone. Apple pie tonight. The 50 German women prisoners standing in formation outside their barracks didn't react at first. Most didn't understand English well enough to catch the meaning. Those who did assumed they had misheard. Katrin Weber stood in the second row, her worn gray auxiliary uniform hanging loose on her frame after 6 weeks of captivity. At 24 years old, she had served as a Wehrmacht clerk in occupied France until Allied forces swept through her unit's position in late August. Now she was prisoner number 147 in a facility that didn't appear on any official military maps, a converted dairy farm somewhere in the Pennsylvania countryside. Apple pie tonight. The phrase meant nothing to her until later that evening when the smell began drifting from the camp kitchen. Katrin was sitting on her bunk, attempting to repair a torn seam in her only spare shirt, when Sophie Zimmerman burst through the barracks door. Her friend's face carried an expression Katrin hadn't seen since before their capture, something between wonder and disbelief. "Katrin, you must come smell this," Sophie said in rapid German. "I don't know what they're cooking, but it smells like my grandmother's kitchen before the war." The other women were already gathering near the windows closest to the kitchen building. Katrin joined them, pressing close to the glass as the autumn wind carried the scent toward their barracks. Butter, cinnamon, something sweet and rich that made her stomach clench with sudden, desperate hunger. "What is it?" someone whispered in German. "The sergeant said apple pie," answered Margrethe Koch, one of the few women who spoke passable English. "It's a dessert." American. Dessert. The word felt foreign, almost obscene. In Germany, they had been eating potato peelings and cabbage soup for the past 2 years. Katrin's last memory of real dessert was her sister's birthday in 1942, a small cake made with carefully hoarded sugar and artificial sweetener that tasted more like cardboard than celebration. The women stood at the windows for nearly an hour, watching smoke rise from the kitchen chimney, breathing in the impossible sweetness that contradicted everything they had been taught to expect from American captivity. They had been warned about cruel interrogations, starvation rations, possible execution. No one had mentioned apple pie. When Corporal Helen Bradshaw appeared at the barracks door to escort them to the mess hall, Katrin noticed something unexpected in the American woman's expression. Not the usual professional distance of guard toward prisoner, but something softer. Almost anticipation, as if she were waiting to see their reactions to what came next. "Ladies," Corporal Bradshaw said in her careful, slow English, "dinner is ready." The 50 women filed out into the October darkness, following the American guard toward the dining hall. But this time, for the first time since their capture, they weren't walking toward just another meal. They were walking toward something that would change everything they thought they knew about their enemies, about captivity, and about what it meant to be shown unexpected kindness in the middle of war. Katrin Weber's last real meal in Germany had been in March of 1943, more than 18 months before her capture. She remembered it with the kind of clarity that only deprivation can sharpen. Her mother had somehow obtained half a chicken, trading away her wedding ring to a farmer outside Hamburg who still had livestock the government hadn't yet requisitioned. They had gathered around the kitchen table that evening, just the 3 of them. Katrin, her mother, and her younger sister Clara. Her father had been dead for 2 years, killed in the winter campaign in Russia. Her brother was somewhere in North Africa, his letters increasingly rare and cryptic. The chicken, roasted with the last of their salt and a few precious herbs from the window box, had seemed like a feast from another lifetime. "Make it last," her mother had whispered, portioning out impossibly small pieces. "Chew slowly. Remember what real food tastes like." By 1944, remembering had become a form of torture. Katrin had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps not out of patriotic fervor, but because military service meant slightly larger rations. The promise of an extra slice of bread per day had been enough to make her sign the papers, to put on the gray uniform, to accept assignment as a clerk in occupied France. But even military rations had been a cruel joke. Breakfast was ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns and a slice of black bread so dense it could break teeth. Lunch was watery soup with perhaps one potato, maybe a sliver of turnip if they were fortunate. Dinner was more bread, sometimes with a smear of margarine that tasted like rendered cardboard. The other women in the barracks had their own hunger stories. Sophie Zimmermann had fainted twice at her post in Berlin from malnutrition before her transfer to France. Margaretha Koch had watched her infant nephew die because her sister couldn't produce enough milk to nurse him. Anna Brandt had stolen food from the officers' mess and spent 3 days in the stockade, emerging thinner and more hollow-eyed than before. When the Allied forces overran their position in August, Katrin's first thought hadn't been fear of capture. It had been the wild, shameful hope that American prisoners might be fed more than German soldiers. She had heard stories, propaganda really, about American excess and waste. She hadn't believed them. The Reich's newsreels showed Americans as weaklings, soft and decadent. But they also, contradictorily, claimed that America was starving, that the British blockade had succeeded in reverse, that the Allies were desperate and depleted. The truth had been immediate and shocking. On the transport ship to America, they had been given white bread, real white bread, soft and fresh, with actual butter. Katrin had eaten her portion so quickly she'd made herself sick, her shrunken stomach unable to process such richness after years of deprivation. But even that hadn't prepared her for what apple pie might mean. As she walked toward the mess hall with the other women, Katrin felt something dangerous stirring inside her. Hope. And with hope came the most frightening question of all. What else had they been lied to about? The mess hall fell into unusual silence as the 50 German women took their seats. Normally, the evening meal involved the quiet clatter of tin plates and murmured conversations in German, carefully neutral exchanges that revealed nothing to their American captors. Tonight, every woman sat perfectly still, watching as Corporal Helen Bradshaw and 2 other guards wheeled in metal carts from the kitchen. The pies sat in rows, golden and perfect, steam still rising from latticed crusts that glistened with sugar crystals. Katrin counted 12 pies total, each one cut into generous slices that seemed impossibly large. The scent of cinnamon and baked apples filled the room so completely that she felt dizzy with it. "Ladies," Corporal Bradshaw announced, her voice carrying across the silent hall, "apple pie, as promised, made fresh this afternoon by our cook, Mrs. Patterson, with apples from local orchards." The guards began serving, placing 1 slice before each prisoner. Katrin stared down at her plate, unable to quite believe what she was seeing. The slice was as large as her hand, the crust a rich butter yellow that looked nothing like the gray pastry she remembered from before the war. Through the lattice top, she could see thick chunks of apple swimming in dark, spiced juice. Beside her, Sophie Zimmermann made a small sound, something between a laugh and a sob. Across the table, Anna Brandt touched 1 finger to the edge of her crust, then quickly pulled it back as if the pie might disappear if handled too roughly. "Go ahead," Corporal Bradshaw said, more gently than Katrin had ever heard her speak. "It's meant to be eaten while it's warm." Katrin picked up her fork with a hand that trembled slightly. The crust broke easily under the slightest pressure, flaking apart to reveal the tender apples beneath. She lifted a small bite to her mouth, aware that every woman in the room was doing the same, all of them moving in collective hesitation. The taste hit her like a physical shock. Sweetness. Real sweetness. Not the chemical aftertaste of saccharin but genuine sugar, coating her tongue and flooding her senses. The apples were tender but not mushy, seasoned with cinnamon and something else she couldn't name, maybe nutmeg or allspice. The crust melted against the roof of her mouth, buttery and rich and impossibly light. Katrin closed her eyes and felt tears sliding down her cheeks before she could stop them. Around her, she heard similar sounds of grief and joy intermingled. Sophie was crying openly, her shoulders shaking as she took another bite. Margaretha Koch sat frozen, her fork halfway to her mouth, staring at the pie as if it might hold answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. This wasn't prison food. This wasn't even soldier food. This was something their own families couldn't have made in Germany for years, something that spoke of abundance, so complete, so casual, that an enemy could afford to share it with prisoners who had tried to destroy them. The barracks remained unusually quiet long after lights out that night. Katrine lay on her bunk in the darkness, listening to the restless movements of 50 women who couldn't sleep. The taste of apple pie still lingered in her mouth, sweet and impossible, a flavor that refused to fade into memory. "It doesn't make sense," Sophie whispered, from the bunk beside hers. "Why would they feed us like that?" "Maybe it's propaganda," Anna Brandt suggested from across the room. "Something they'll photograph and send back to Germany. Look how well we treat our prisoners. See how merciful America is." "There were no cameras," Margaretha Koch pointed out. "No one taking pictures of us eating. No newsreel crews filming our reactions." The women fell silent again, each wrestling with the same contradiction. They had been taught that Americans were cruel, that capture meant torture or death, that the enemy would show no mercy to German soldiers, especially women who had served the Reich. The training films had been explicit, the propaganda posters even more so. America was depicted as a nation of savages, mongrels, inferior races mixed together in weakness and degeneracy. Yet tonight they had been served apple pie made with real butter, real sugar, fresh apples from Pennsylvania orchards. Not slop. Not prisoner rations. Dessert. "What if," Katrine said slowly, speaking the thought that had been growing in her mind since that first bite, "what if everything we were told was wrong?" The suggestion hung in the darkness like something dangerous and forbidden. To question one thing was to question everything. If the Americans weren't cruel, what else might be untrue? If they had been lied to about their enemies, what about the other things they had been told? About the war, about Germany's inevitable victory, about the righteousness of their cause. "Don't," Sophie said sharply. "Don't start thinking like that, Katrin. It's dangerous." "Dangerous for who?" Katrin asked. "We're already prisoners. What more can they do to us?" "It's dangerous for us," Sophie insisted. "If we start believing them, start trusting them, what happens when we go home? What will we be then? Traitors." The word went unspoken, but they all heard it anyway. In Germany, soldiers who fraternized with the enemy, who accepted their generosity, who began to see them as human rather than monsters, those soldiers had a name: collaborators. And collaborators faced consequences that made captivity look merciful. "Maybe," Anna said quietly, "maybe that's the real test. Not whether we can endure cruelty, but whether we can endure kindness. Whether we can accept it without letting it change us." But Katrin knew it was already too late for that. The apple pie had changed something fundamental in how she saw the world. One slice of dessert had cracked open a door she had kept carefully locked since joining the Auxiliary Corps. Behind that door were questions she had been avoiding for years. Questions about loyalty, about truth, about which version of reality she was supposed to believe. And lying in the darkness, still tasting cinnamon and sugar, Katrine realized she could no longer avoid those questions. The second Thursday came without announcement. Katrin was folding laundry in the supply room when she caught the scent drifting through the window: cinnamon, butter, apples. Her hands stilled on the gray uniform shirt she'd been smoothing flat, and for a moment she simply breathed in the smell that had haunted her dreams for 7 days. By the third Thursday, the women had learned to watch the calendar. They marked the days in small, private ways. Sophie made tiny scratches on the underside of her bunk frame. Margaretha kept count in her head, whispering the numbers in German when she thought no one was listening. Thursday became more than just another day of captivity. It became something to anticipate, to hope for, and hope was a dangerous thing for prisoners to carry. By the fourth Thursday in November, Katrin made a decision that surprised even herself. During the morning work assignments, when Corporal Bradshaw asked for volunteers for kitchen duty, Katrin raised her hand before she could reconsider. The corporal's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You sure, Weber? Kitchen work is hot and the hours are long." "Yes, Corporal," Katrin said in her careful English. "I am sure." The camp kitchen was nothing like the cramped, smoke-filled spaces Katrin remembered from Germany. It was large and clean, with industrial ovens that actually worked, and storage rooms stocked with ingredients she hadn't seen in years. Mrs. Patterson, the head cook, was a broad-shouldered woman in her 50s with flour permanently dusted on her apron and gray hair pinned back in a practical bun. "Helen says you volunteered," Mrs. Patterson said, studying Katrin with sharp blue eyes. "You know how to cook?" "Some," Katrin admitted. "My mother taught me before the war." "Well then, you can start by peeling potatoes for dinner. After that, if you're good with your hands, maybe I'll show you how we make the crust." The hours passed in a blur of work. Katrin peeled potatoes until her fingers cramped, washed dishes until her arms ached, and swept floors until her back protested. But when Mrs. Patterson finally gestured her over to the large wooden table where she was rolling out dough, Katrin's exhaustion vanished. "The secret is keeping everything cold," Mrs. Patterson explained, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Cold butter, cold water, and you don't overwork it. Touch it too much and it gets tough." She demonstrated, cutting butter into flour with 2 knives until the mixture resembled coarse crumbs. "Now you try." Katrin's first attempt was clumsy. Her second was better. By the third, Mrs. Patterson nodded with something approaching approval. Corporal Bradshaw watched from the doorway, saying nothing but present nonetheless. When Katrin glanced up, she caught the corporal's expression. Not suspicion, as she'd expected. Something closer to satisfaction, as if this was exactly what she'd hoped would happen. "Not bad, Weber," Mrs. Patterson said, examining Katrin's crust. "Keep practicing, and maybe you'll get good enough to make one on your own." She paused, then added more softly, "Thursday's just a few days away." Katrin began carrying a small notebook, something Corporal Bradshaw had given her without comment one morning. Officially, prisoners weren't supposed to have writing materials beyond censored letters home. But the corporal had slipped the notebook into Katrin's hand during kitchen duty and said simply, "For the recipes. Can't learn if you don't write it down." The first entry was apple pie, written in Katrin's careful script with measurements translated from English to German in parentheses. 1 cup butter, cold. 2 1/2 cups flour. 6 to 8 apples, peeled and sliced. The instructions read like poetry to her. Cut butter into flour until mixture resembles coarse crumbs. Add ice water 1 tablespoon at a time. Handle gently, as though the dough might break. Mrs. Patterson was a patient teacher but demanded precision. "Baking isn't like cooking," she explained, while Katrin practiced crimping pie edges. "Cooking you can adjust, taste as you go, add a pinch of this or that. Baking is science. You follow the recipe, or you fail." By December, Katrin had filled 6 pages with recipes. Apple pie, naturally, but also chicken pot pie, beef stew with dumplings, cornbread with honey butter, and something called chocolate chip cookies that used more sugar in one batch than her family had seen in a month back in Germany. One afternoon, while rolling out dough, Katrin found herself telling Mrs. Patterson about her grandmother's apple strudel. The words came haltingly at first, her English still imperfect when describing the paper-thin dough stretched across an entire table, the mixture of breadcrumbs and cinnamon, the way the pastry would shatter into golden flakes when you bit into it. "Sounds wonderful," Mrs. Patterson said. "Think you could make it?" Katrin hesitated. "I would need different flour, thinner, and the technique, it takes practice. My grandmother learned from her mother." "Well," Corporal Bradshaw said from her usual spot near the door, "suppose you wrote down what you remember. Maybe we could figure it out together." That evening, Katrine wrote her first recipe in reverse, describing in English a dish she'd only ever made in German. The act of translation felt significant, as though she were building a bridge between two versions of herself. The girl who had learned to bake in her grandmother's Hamburg kitchen, and the woman who now measured ingredients in American cups and tablespoons. Sophie noticed the notebook one night and asked to see it. Soon other women were contributing their own family recipes. Margrethe added her mother's potato pancakes. Anna wrote down instructions for Black Forest cake, though she noted sadly that they'd need cherries and kirsch, items unlikely to appear in a prison camp. Helena Vogel contributed her aunt's Sauerbraten recipe, the one that required 3 days of marinating in wine and vinegar. The notebook became something precious, passed carefully among the women during evening hours. It was more than recipes. It was memory, identity, and proof that they had come from somewhere real, that they had families and traditions worth preserving. But it was also something new, something that only existed because of their captivity. A collaboration between enemies, a document that couldn't exist in the world outside these fences. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in early January 1945. Katrin recognized her sister Clara's handwriting on the envelope even before Corporal Bradshaw handed it to her. The paper was thin, rationed quality, and the censor stamps covered half the front. Her hands shook as she opened it. The words were brief and careful, written to pass military inspection. Clara was alive, living in the ruins of what remained of Hamburg. Their mother had died in the bombing raids of July 1943. The apartment was gone. Clara was staying with an aunt in the countryside, working in a munitions factory for food rations. She didn't ask when Katrin might come home. Perhaps she already knew the answer would be too complicated to write. Katrin read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it in her footlocker. She didn't cry. Couldn't cry. The grief sat inside her chest like a stone, heavy and immovable. Her mother had been dead for 18 months, and she was only learning about it now. She had been eating apple pie while her mother's body was being pulled from rubble. That Thursday, the smell of cinnamon made her feel sick. She went to the kitchen anyway, unable to break the routine that had become the structure of her days. Mrs. Patterson took one look at her face and said nothing, simply pointing to the potatoes that needed peeling. Katrin worked in silence, her knife moving mechanically, her mind somewhere else entirely. "Bad news from home?" Mrs. Patterson asked finally, her voice gentle. Katrin nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "I'm sorry, honey." Mrs. Patterson's hand rested briefly on Katrine's shoulder, a gesture of comfort that made the stone in her chest crack slightly. "Lost my boy at Normandy, June of last year. Every day I wake up and for just a second I forget, and then I remember all over again." Katrin looked up, surprised. She had known, intellectually, that Americans also lost people in this war. But hearing it spoken aloud by this woman who had taught her to make pie crust, who had shared her kitchen and her recipes, made it suddenly, devastatingly real. "I'm sorry," Katrin whispered in English. "Me too, Mrs. Patterson said. "Sorry for all of it, the whole damn war." That night, Corporal Bradshaw found Katrin sitting alone, outside the barracks, staring at the winter sky. The corporal sat down beside her without asking permission, their breath making clouds in the cold air. "My husband was killed at Guadalcanal," Bradshaw said quietly. "2 years ago this month. We'd been married 8 months. She was silent for a moment. "I volunteered for Nemersay, guard duty, because I couldn't stand being home anymore. Couldn't stand looking at his empty chair, his clothes still in the closet. Thought maybe if I came here, did something useful, it would hurt less." "Does it?" Katrine asked. "No," Bradshaw admitted. "But at least here I'm not hurting alone." They sat together in the darkness, guard and prisoner, enemy and enemy, 2 women who had both lost too much to this war. The hunger Katrin felt now wasn't for food or even for home. It was for an end to the grief, For a world where mothers didn't die in bombing raids and husbands didn't fall on foreign beaches. For a future where apple pie could just be apple pie, sweet and simple, without carrying the weight of everything they'd lost. Katrin sat at the small table in the barracks common area, a blank piece of censored stationery in front of her. The Red Cross provided 2 sheets per month for prisoners to write home. She had written to Clara twice since receiving news of their mother's death. Careful letters full of reassurances that revealed nothing about her daily life. This letter was different. This one she couldn't send. Dear Clara. She wrote in German, her handwriting small and precise. Today I made apple pie. Real apple pie with butter and cinnamon and apples from Pennsylvania orchards. The crust was perfect, golden and flaky, exactly as Mrs. Patterson taught me. She's the American cook here. She lost her son at Normandy. Katrin paused, reading back what she'd written. Every sentence felt like a confession of betrayal. How could she tell her sister, starving in Germany, that she was learning to bake desserts in an enemy prison camp? That she looked forward to Thursdays? That she had begun to care whether Mrs. Patterson approved of her crimping technique? I know what you would think if you read this. She continued writing. You would think I've forgotten where I come from, forgotten what we've suffered, forgotten Mother. But Clara, I remember everything. I remember every moment. Maybe that's why the pie matters so much. Because it's the only thing that doesn't hurt to remember. The barracks door opened, and Corporal Bradshaw entered, making her evening rounds. She noticed Katrin at the table and paused. Letter home? She asked. A letter I cannot send home, Katrin corrected quietly. Bradshaw pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without invitation. Why not? Because it would sound like I am happy here, like I am collaborating. Katrin gestured at the paper. I am writing about apple pie while my sister eats turnip soup, while my country burns. Are you happy here? Bradshaw asked. The question was more complicated than it should have been. No, Katrin said finally. But I am less unhappy than I was before, and that feels like betrayal. Bradshaw was quiet for a long moment. My husband used to say that surviving isn't the same as betraying. That taking care of yourself doesn't mean you've stopped caring about others. She looked at Katrin with unexpected intensity. You're allowed to eat the pie, Weber. You're allowed to learn the recipe. You're allowed to have moments that don't hurt. That doesn't make you disloyal to your sister or your mother's memory. How do you know? Katrin whispered. Because if it did, Bradshaw said softly, then I'd be betraying my husband every time I laugh at something Mrs. Patterson says, every time I have a good day. Every Thursday when I watch you women eat pie and I feel glad that I'm here, doing this, instead of home drowning in grief. Katrin looked down at her letter, at the words she could never send. Then slowly, deliberately, she folded the paper and placed it in her notebook between the recipes. Not a letter, a record. Proof that she had lived through this impossible time when kindness from enemies felt more genuine than anything she'd known before. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The announcement came over the camp, loudspeaker during breakfast. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Around the mess hall, American guards embraced each other, some crying with relief. Outside, church bells rang from the nearby town, their sound carrying across the Pennsylvania countryside in waves of celebration. The 50 German women sat frozen at their tables, spoons halfway to their mouths, comprehending what this meant for them. The war was over. They had lost. Everything they had been told would never happen had happened. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. Captain Charlotte Pierce called an assembly that afternoon. The women gathered in the main hall, their faces carefully blank, as the captain explained the repatriation process. Transportation would be arranged within 6 weeks. They would be processed through camps in Europe before being released to return to whatever remained of their homes. You're free to go home, Captain Pierce said. The words should have brought relief. Instead, they landed like stones. That night, the barracks erupted into desperate conversations. Some women wept with joy at the prospect of returning to Germany. Others sat silent, staring at nothing, clearly wrestling with thoughts they couldn't speak aloud. Sophie paced the narrow aisle between bunks, her movements jerky with anxiety. "What is there to return to?" she asked no one in particular. "My entire family is dead. My city is rubble. What am I going home to?" "It's still home," Anna insisted, but her voice carried no conviction. Katrin sat on her bunk, her recipe notebook open on her lap. She had written to Clara 3 times since Victory Day was announced. Her sister's responses had been brief and bleak. Food was scarce. The occupation was harsh. Former soldiers, especially women who had served the Reich, were viewed with suspicion by both Germans and occupying forces. Clara didn't explicitly tell her not to come home, but the message was clear enough between the careful lines. The next Thursday, Mrs. Patterson made apple pie as usual. But this time, when Katrin arrived for kitchen duty, the cook handed her the rolling pin and stepped back. "Your turn, Mrs. Patterson said. "Start to finish. Show me what you've learned." Katrin's hands moved through the familiar motions. Cold butter cut into flour. Ice water added 1 tablespoon at a time. Dough rolled out thin and even, then carefully fitted into pie tins. Apples peeled and sliced, tossed with cinnamon and sugar. Lattice tops, woven and crimped. The pies slid into the oven, and Katrin stood watching through the glass door as the crusts turned golden. "Perfect," Mrs. Patterson said quietly when they emerged. "Absolutely perfect." Corporal Bradshaw appeared in the doorway. "Weber, Captain Pierce wants to see you." Katrine wiped flour from her hands, removed her apron, and followed the corporal across the compound. She knew what the captain would ask. The same question she'd been asking herself every night since the surrender. "Where do you want to go? What do you choose? The homeland that starved you, or the enemy that fed you apple pie?" Captain Pierce's office was small and neat, with a window overlooking the vegetable garden the prisoners had planted in March. Katrin stood at attention, her hands clasped behind her back, while the captain reviewed papers on her desk. "At ease, Weber," Pierce said finally. "This isn't a disciplinary meeting." She looked up, her expression unreadable. "I've received word that you've been exemplary during your time here, Mrs. Patterson speaks very highly of your work in the kitchen. Corporal Bradshaw has recommended you for a displaced person's visa." Katrin's breath caught. A visa meant staying in America. It meant not returning to Germany, not facing the ruins of Hamburg, not trying to rebuild a life among people who would see her auxiliary service as either collaboration or failure, depending on which way the wind blew. "I have a Safin sister," Katrin said carefully. "In Germany. She has no one else." "I know," Pierce said. "We've been monitoring your correspondence. She's urged you not to return, hasn't she?" Katrine nodded, unable to speak. "The choice is yours, Weber. No one will force you to stay, and no one will prevent you from leaving. But I want you to understand what staying would mean. You'd be processed as a displaced person, not a prisoner. You'd need employment, housing, a sponsor. It wouldn't be easy. Mrs. Patterson has offered me a position," Katrin heard herself say. "Her bakery in town needs help. She said if I wanted to stay, she would sponsor my visa application." Pierce nodded slowly. "And what do you want?" The question hung in the air between them. What did she want? To return to a country that no longer existed, to a sister who told her not to come, to a life that had been bombed into rubble? Or to stay in this strange place where enemies had become something closer to friends, where she had learned to make apple pie and found unexpected kindness in the middle of war? "I want," Katrin said slowly, "to be somewhere I can be useful. Somewhere I can build something instead of sorting through ruins." 23 years later, Katrin Weber Bradshaw stood in her bakery in downtown Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The morning rush had ended and she was preparing the day's pies. Apple, always apple, made from the recipe Mrs. Patterson had taught her in a prison camp kitchen in 1944. The bell above the door chimed. Katrin looked up to see an older woman enter, her face weathered but familiar. Clara. Her sister Clara, visiting America for the first time, finally able to travel after decades of separation. They embraced without words, tears flowing freely. Then Katrin led her sister to the kitchen, poured 2 cups of coffee, and cut 2 slices of apple pie still warm from the oven. "This is what made me stay," Katrin said simply, pushing a plate across the table. "This is what taught me that home isn't where you're from. It's where you choose to build something worth keeping." Clara took a bite, closed her eyes, and smiled through her tears. "I understand," she whispered. "I finally understand."